hours. This last gentleman went on to say that, unfortunately as yet, perhaps, privacy was not quite so easily obtained in America as might be desired. Still, he continued, you could generally get it by paying for it. In fact, you could get everything in America nowadays by paying for it. American life was certainly growing a great deal more private. It was growing very much like England. Everything at Newport, for instance, was thoroughly private. Lord Lambeth would probably be struck with that. It was also represented to the strangers that it mattered very little whether their hotel was agreeable, as everyone would want them to make visits. They would stay with other people, and in any case, they would be a great deal at Mrs. Westgate's. They would find that very charming. It was the pleasantest house in Newport. It was a pity Mr. Westgate was always away. He was a man of the highest ability, very acute, very acute. He worked like a horse, and he left his wife, well, to do about as she liked. He liked her to enjoy herself, and she seemed to know how. She was extremely brilliant and a splendid talker. Some people preferred her sister, but Miss Alden was very different. She was in a different style altogether. Some people even thought her prettier, and certainly she was not so sharp. She was more in the Boston style. She had lived a great deal in Boston, and she was very highly educated. Boston girls, it was propounded, were more like English young ladies. Lord Lambeth had presently a chance to test the truth of this proposition, for on the company rising in compliance with the suggestion from their hostess that they should walk down to the rocks and look at the sea, the young Englishman again found himself, as they strolled across the grass, in proximity to Mrs. Westgate's sister. Though she was but a girl of 20, she appeared to feel the obligation to exert an active hospitality, and this was perhaps the more to be noticed as she seemed by nature a reserved and retiring person, and had little of her sister's fraternizing quality. She was perhaps rather too thin, and she was a little pale, but as she moved slowly over the grass, with her arms hanging at her sides, looking gravely for a moment at the sea, and then brightly, for all her gravity, at him, Lord Lambeth thought her at least as pretty as Mrs. Westgate, and reflected that if this was the Boston style was very charming. He thought she looked very clever. He could imagine that she was highly educated, but at the same time she seemed gentle and graceful. For all her cleverness, however, he felt that she had to think a little what to say. She didn't say the first thing that came into her head. He had come from a different part of the world and from a different society, and she was trying to adapt her conversation. The others were scattering themselves near the rocks. Mrs. Westgate had charge of Percy Beaumont. "Very jolly place, isn't it?" said Lord Lambeth. "It's a very jolly place to sit." "Very charming," said the young girl. "I often sit here. There are all kinds of cozy corners, as if they had been made on purpose." "Ah, I suppose you have had some of them made," said the young man. Miss Alden looked at him a moment. "Oh, no, we have had nothing made. It's pure nature." "I should think you would have a few little benches, rustic seats, and that sort of thing. Might be so jolly to sit there, you know," Lord Lambeth went on. "I am afraid we haven't so many of those things as you," said the young girl thoughtfully. "I dare say you go in for pure nature, as you were saying. Nature over here must be so grand, you know," and Lord Lambeth looked about him. The little coastline hereabouts was very pretty, but it was not at all grand, and Miss Alden appeared to rise to a perception of this fact. "I'm afraid it seems to you very rough," she said. "It's not like the coast scenery in Kingsley's novels." "Ah, the novels always overdo it, you know," Lord Lambeth rejoined. "You must not go by the novels." They were wandering about a little on the rocks, and they stopped and looked down into a narrow chasm where the rising tide made a curious bellowing sound. It was loud enough to prevent their hearing each other, and they stood there for some moments in silence. The young girl looked at her companion, observing him attentively, but covertly, as women, even when very young, know how to do. Lord Lambeth repaid observation. Tall, straight and strong. He was handsome as certain young Englishmen, and certain young Englishmen almost alone are handsome, with a perfect finish of feature and a look of intellectual repose and gentle good temper, which seemed somehow to be consequent upon his well-cut nose and chin. And to speak of Lord Lambeth's expression of intellectual repose is not simply a civil way of saying that he looked stupid. He was evidently not a young man of an irritable imagination. He was not, as he would himself have said, tremendously clever. But though there was a kind of appealing dullness in his eyes, he looked thoroughly reasonable and competent, and his appearance proclaimed that to be a nobleman, an athlete, and an excellent fellow was a sufficiently brilliant combination of qualities. The young girl beside him, it may be attested without further delay, thought him the handsomest young man she had ever seen, and Bessie Alden's imagination, unlike that of her companion, was irritable. He, however, was also making up his mind that she was uncommonly pretty. "I dare say it's very gay here, that you have lots of balls and parties," he said, for if he was not tremendously clever, he rather prided himself on having, with women, a sufficiency of conversation. "Oh, yes, there is a great deal going on," Bessie Alden replied. "There are not so many balls, but there are a good many other things. You will see for yourself. We live rather in the midst of it." "It's very kind of you to say that, but I thought you Americans were always dancing." "I suppose we dance a good deal, but I've never seen much of it. We don't do it much, at any rate, in summer. And I am sure," said Bessie Alden, "that we don't have so many balls as you have in England." "Really?" exclaimed Lord Lambeth. "Ah, in England it all depends, you know." "You will not think much of our gaieties," said the young girl, looking at him with a little mixture of interrogation and decision which was peculiar to her. The interrogation seemed earnest, and the decision seemed arch, but the mixture, at any rate, was charming. "Those things with us are much less splendid than in England." "Oh, I fancy you don't mean that," said Lord Lambeth, laughing. "I assure you I mean everything I say," the young girl declared. "Certainly, from what I have read about English society, it is very different." "Ah, well, you know," said her companion, "those things are often described by fellows who know nothing about them. You mustn't mind what you read." "Oh, I shall mind what I read," Bessie Alden rejoined. "When I read Thackeray and George Eliot, how can I help minding them?" "Ah, well, Thackeray and George Eliot," said the young nobleman. "I haven't read much of them." "Don't you suppose they know about society?" asked Bessie Alden. "Oh, I dare say they know. They were so very clever. But these fashionable novels," said Lord Lambeth, "they are awful rot, you know." His companion looked at him a moment with her dark blue eyes, and then she looked down in the chasm where the water was tumbling about. "Do you mean Mrs. Gore, for instance?" she said presently, raising her eyes. "I'm afraid I haven't read that either," was the young man's rejoinder, laughing a little and blushing. "I am afraid you'll think I'm not very intellectual." "Reading Mrs. Gore is no proof of intellect. But I like reading everything about English life, even poor books. I'm so curious about it." "Aren't ladies always curious?" asked the young man jestingly. But Bessie Alden appeared to desire to answer his question seriously. "I don't think so. I don't think we are enough so, that we care about many things. So it's all the more of a compliment," she added, "that I should want to know so much about England." The logic here seemed a little close, but Lord Lambeth, made conscious of a compliment, found his natural modesty just at hand. "I'm sure you know a great deal more than I do." "I really think I know a great deal, for a person who's never been there." "Have you really never been there?" cried Lord Lambeth. "Fancy!" "Never, except in imagination," said the young girl. "Fancy!" repeated her companion. "But I dare say you'll go soon, won't you?" "It's the dream of my life," declared Bessie Alden, smiling. "But your sister seems to know a tremendous lot about London," Lord Lambeth went on. The young girl was silent a moment.